Look at the people in the streets, in the bars. We are all of us in the gutter. Some of us are looking at the stars. Look round the room. Life is unkind. We fall, but we keep getting up. Over and 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 over.
Welcome to The Behaviorist with Work Wisdom, where we help you adopt high-performance mindsets, behaviors, communication, and culture. I'm your host, Kedron Crosby. Our intention for the Behaviorist podcast is to share accessible, concrete practices that you can weave into your whole life to begin a shift toward joy and meaningful achievement. We're grateful today to be hearing from The Pretenders, as well as Dr. Jill Kozer, Director of Curriculum and Instruction from the School District of the City of York, and Joe McMonigal, Vice President of Atomic Design. Hello, friends.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks so much for being part of this show today and sharing your ideas. As our listeners probably know, Work Wisdom seeks to revolutionize achievement. So today we're exploring what role optimism plays in helping us achieve and flourish. So my first question is this idea of what was the most optimistic thing that we've ever done? So Joe, do you have an idea? What was the most optimistic thing that you've ever done?
You know, that's kind of a trick question to an optimist because everything is awesome and full of possibility, right? Every single day. So it's kind of hard to pick one.
Yeah. Was it breakfast this morning?
I mean, getting out of bed was awesome.
That was so incredible.
Yeah. But honestly, I can think back to the first time you invited me to be a part of the Work Wisdom podcast. It's super outside of my comfort zone. And so I thought that I would try it anyway, because I felt like there was something to be learned from being a part of a conversation like this. And like I said, it was out of my comfort zone. I was a part of it, and I felt like we did a good job as a team.
You're amazing.
And I really enjoyed, learning from that experience. And so maybe not the most in the world, because like I said, every day is full of super high points. But one for sure was being a part of this last time around.
Yeah. And now you're an expert, you're like the house band. We're like, let's just call Joey McMonigal. He'll do it. He'll do anything. Jill, do you have one in mind? What's the most optimistic thing you've ever done?
I'm just cracking up because Joe, I'm sitting here looking at my list of 5 or 6 different things that I wrote down and couldn't decide either.
Awesome.
But I would say I would land on the most optimistic thing I've ever done was becoming a parent.
It sure takes a lot of optimism to do that.
Absolutely does, especially in this world and in this day and age.
Yeah. Well, let's define optimism. So I, of course, am going to use the emotional intelligence EQ definition of optimism. So optimism is an indicator of one's positive attitude and outlook on life. It involves remaining hopeful and resilient despite occasional setbacks. So optimism and hope are so important, and that they're actually 2 of the 4 key components of psychological capital. It was probably 3 months ago that we had an episode of The Behaviorist where we talked about PsyCap, or psychological capital. And since it was a few months ago, I'll provide a quick refresher. So basically, there are 4 types of capital which we can invest in any entity. So whether it's a cool company like Atomic or an essential part of civil society like a school district. So the 4 types of capital are traditional economic capital, and we think about finances or tangible assets like plants, equipments. There's human capital, which is what you know. So that's our education, our experience, our skills, our ideas. And then there's social capital, which is who you know, your relationships, your friends, your networks. And then there's PsyCap, or psychological capital. And then this is who you are. So this has 4 components, and it's confidence and hope, optimism, and resilience. And sometimes this confidence is called efficacy. So in positive psychology, we have this clever little acronym for what psychological capital is, and they call it HERO. So it's hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism, and that makes the word hero. So I'm not going to go too far down that thread, but I do want to just tell you some of the definitions for hope. So hope is actually a positive state where our feelings of agency or our goal-oriented determination, and then our pathways. So how proactively we can plan to achieve those goals, how they interact. So that feeling of agency, and then our pathways and how do they interact. So that's what hope is. And I also wanted to give you the positive psychology definition of optimism, which is optimism is theorized as a realistically positive view of what we can or cannot do. So realistically positive view of what we cannot or can do. The reason why we really want to explore this, of course, is because there are positive, significant empirical relationships between PSI-CAP and job satisfaction, organizational commitment, psychological well-being, desirable employee behaviors like citizenship, and conversely, you can see the negative. So if you have low PSI-CAP, this hero that I'm talking about, you have undesirable employee attitudes, more like cynicism, turnover, stress, anxiety, and we actually call it deviance, which means undesirable employee behaviors. So the reason why these 4 capacities are the ones that Fred Luthans chose to define PSI-CAP is because they're measurable. They are open to development, meaning they're changeable, and they can be managed in the workplace. So that was sort of me on my soapbox wearing my professor hat. I'm now climbing off of my soapbox, and I want to talk about real behavior and what all of this really means to us. So both of you are very important leaders in your organization, and an important and measurable part of being a leader is this idea of inspiration, or sometimes we call it insight. So inspiration is where a leader shares a purpose of a hopeful vision for colleagues to follow. So this means the team can become compelled or inspired to exceed their goals. So we know this is a big part of inspirational leadership, and it's really bolstered by optimism. So when you think about being a leader, do you ever try to make optimism or even hope contagious? Have you ever tried to bake it in either to the culture or maybe even in your home life? So, Jill, what do you think? Maybe think about work for a minute. Are there times that you're trying to make optimism or hope contagious? What does that look like?
Absolutely. So for me, in leading several different teams, schools, organizations, really it's like a twofold process for me, right, of how you bake this in. One is building that concept of hope and continuously developing that deep well of why people are coming in to do this work every day with students, with families, with each other as colleagues. And so we do that in a couple of ways. I love that definition you just read of hope, where it talked about the feelings of agency personally, plus a pathway to get there, right? Mm-hmm. So it's, thinking about this idea of optimism paired with self-actualization or strategy. So it's not just a random optimism, we're happy all the time, where our head is always in the cloud, but it's a really intentional process to build optimism and to build hope. And so, some of the ways that we've done that is just focusing on those bright spots, looking for the things that are going right, looking for the students who are just shining and thriving, and examining those case studies and saying, what's working here in this classroom, in this school, with this program or initiative. And so really being intentional about identifying bright spots, but again, not just randomly, looking at those bright spots as they're associated with our strategy, our culture, our core values, our identified goals and practices and behaviors that we want to see as a team. So being really clear in what optimism and hope looks like, what that positivity looks like in your organization's culture, but then calling attention to those really specific practices so that everybody starts to understand and develop a common set of behaviors that align to our goals and our values.
Yeah, it's been such a joy to see you do that in your career, where you are very intentional about what's the behavior that inspires hope or optimism and then shines the light on. And then you really shine the light on those behaviors that foster that value. So Joe, as you know, we at Work Wisdom, we don't just think about work, we think about our whole lives. So can you think of any ways where you're fostering optimism or hope, trying to make it contagious, maybe within your family life?
Yeah, I can. But first, I want to just think about what Jill just said, which was so cool. Defining optimism and hope is a really interesting thing to help it be distinguished from what can be perceived as like naivety or ignorance of the challenges of the real challenges of a situation or a strategy. That's a really cool concept that I've never considered before. And I'm, as Kedron may have mentioned, on the high optimism usage side of things. So sometimes I feel like I'm trapped by this perception that I don't understand how hard things are or how challenging things can be because I'm optimistic. But defining what optimism and hope can mean is a great way to make sure it's clear what optimism and hope aren't, meaning like naivety. So, so thanks for sharing that, Jill. That was really cool. Which then I guess leads me to your question. Defining hope and hope and optimism in the family can also it's a tricky thing sometimes because not everybody lives the same experience. I think of optimism often, and maybe even incorrectly, as I'm learning through this, through the definitions you just shared, as really being a focus or an outcome of perspective. So I feel like it's very flexible. If someone isn't feeling very hopeful or optimistic, they can be shown just how good things are, and then therefore they will feel the same way. And that's not necessarily true. And it's kind of the risky sort of backside of optimism when unchecked, if left unchecked by empathy, for example, it can be not very positive and not such a helpful thing, especially in a family situation. But baking it in, I mean, I think about how to bake this perspective into your family life or even work and organizational relationships is taking time to take stock of the things that are good, to have a sort of that thankfulness or gratitude focused mindset is a great way to be open to the possibilities that a optimistic or hopeful perspective can shine a light onto.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. And I always think about that, that idea that optimism at its core is this idea that, either way, however this turns out, I'm going to be okay, ultimately. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be able to land on my feet. So it is a positive state. Both hope and optimism are a positive state, but realistic. And they are tied to goal orientation and agency, the pathways to make it come to fruition. So what do we think about the greatest benefit of being highly optimistic? Joe, what do you think the greatest benefit is of being highly optimistic?
On a personal level, I feel like the optimism can help avoid negative stress. When you're trapped in a perspective of this isn't going to work, this is all going to fail, the physical impact of that alone can be really negative. So optimism, I think, puts you in a position to avoid that trap in negative stress and be focused on the possibilities and the outcomes. And I think that frees you up to then pursue those outcomes. If you're in a sticky spot or facing a hard challenge, you need to be creative, you need to be flexible, you need to be resilient. And if all you can see is the potential failure, I don't believe that puts you in a great perspective or great mindset to find the solution.
Yeah. So freeing. So Jill, can you think of any costs to high optimism?
Well, I go back to what Joe said that, sometimes being a high optimist can definitely lead to people not having a true understanding of the intention and the research that's gone into that optimism. And so I think, that could definitely be one. But I think also when there have been times in my life where I've been highly optimistic about a project or an initiative, and I've missed the potential derailers. I've just zoomed over them and I didn't take time to stop and listen to pessimists who have some really valid feedback in some of these situations. And, as a result of that, I failed to plan for those things, and it either stalled or completely halted whatever the program or initiative was. And so I think there's definitely a risk of being overly optimistic. The other piece that I think plays into the costs as well is that there have been times that I've bit off a little more than I can chew. And again, thinking about this in the context of family, my husband and my kids will say, I'll have a list for the weekend. This is what we're getting done. Yes. Oh, we can do that. Sure. You can have your friends over. We'll get it all accomplished. Yeah, no, maybe will get a third of it accomplished at times. So, there's a potential to let others down when you're committing to something that is not a realistic view of what I can actually accomplish or what I can actually do. So certainly there's some costs to be aware of and to recognize and to plan for.
Yeah, I really like this idea of realistic optimism, and this idea of how do we reality test our to-do lists, or our goals for our lives. So do you two have any tips for ensuring that your optimism is sufficiently reality tested? I don't know, Jill, do you have any?
Yeah, so my number one tip would be to marry someone who's very much, very grounded in reality testing.
You beat me to it.
Yeah.
That's been an absolute fantastic asset to my leadership abilities. Just having someone to bounce those ideas off of. But in a work setting, really being intentional about building your team and balancing your team with maybe not necessarily pessimists. I call them detail-oriented optimists. So people who are with you, they believe in it, they're grounded in the hope that you are, but they have an eye for the details. And they want to get where you want them to go, but they just want to know a little bit more about how we're going to get there. And they're going to make sure that we've got a clear path along the way. So really, I would say making sure that there are people around you who are able to have that safety to voice a concern or to ask another question for that next level of detail. Because again, chances are if they're asking it, there's a lot of other people thinking it.
Yeah. Joe, do you have any other tips?
Well, I think, Jill, you nailed it with those two. And I love the optimistic way you just described those reality-based optimists. Is that the word you chose?
My detail-oriented optimist, yes.
Optimist. How optimistic of a way to describe the pessimists in your organization. That's really well done.
They're just detail-oriented.
No, I totally agree. Finding balance with your team, whether that's your partner in life or your partners at work, that's my lifeline. My wife's superpower is empathy. So when I get super focused on my own hopeful aspirations of whether the weekend schedule or any other thing in our life, she's really good at bringing me back to reality because sometimes I can zoom past, like you mentioned, Jill, some of the impacts of the decisions or the speed at which I want to move has real impact on other people. And sometimes I miss that because I'm so focused on how exciting the outcome will be. I know it will be. Just trust me. Let's do it.
Yeah.
No, I think I don't have anything to add, really.
Yeah. So in the world of emotional intelligence, when we're working with people who have extremely high optimism that might have a cost, we usually tell them to find a sounding board. So it could be a husband, it could be some detail-oriented people at work, but finding some sounding board that they can check in with before they make any major life decision is really important. Also checking in with data, and that might come from the detail-oriented people that you're finding, Jill. But looking at past data. Not to commit you to not being able to become an outlier, but also just being more realistic is another way to do that. So let's think about our jobs, and let's think about whether or not we could do our jobs as well as we do without high usage of optimism. So Joey, in your work, do you think you could do your job as well as you do without high usage of optimism?
I really don't. And I think it's because that notion of balance on our team, again, to borrow your phrase, Jill, the detail-oriented optimists on my team are the ones who have to actualize the projects we work on. They have to execute the things. They're challenged with they meet all of the real challenges that come along with a thing. So it's really hard. It's really easy for that group or for anybody in those positions to focus on all the challenges and miss the opportunity side of anything that we work on. So part of my role is to remind us all that there is an outcome here that's positive. The work is going to be hard, yes. It's going to be full of change and uncertainty, yes. And we're going to have to break boundaries into new spaces we've never been before. That's all scary. But when we do it, it will be so cool and so good and so serving of the client's needs. And that's why we're here, because we're good at those things and we're able to meet those challenges. That's why we're in our roles. So I think it's a huge part of the recipe that I bring to the team at Atomic.
Yeah, and there might be other roles at Atomic that wouldn't require the levels of optimism that you need to bring. Is one thing that
True.
I've thought about. Jill, what's it like for you?
Yeah, so thinking about, could I do this job without a high usage of optimism? And my answer is just not a chance. So
Okay.
Education it's just always amazed me because it is one of the fields that is physically demanding all day, every day.
Yeah.
It's emotionally demanding all day, every day. And it's mentally, you're drained. You are in front of people and kids and families and teachers. And you are on all the time, engaging all components of your being. And so I don't think you can do this work without a deep well of optimism. And it's especially important as leaders in education, just to have that well and to be able to monitor when the well is getting a little low, and you need that time as well, because it is absolutely critical to model optimism to every stakeholder that we serve every day.
Yeah. Well, since it's so important, I want to think about the fact that optimism can be learned. So learned optimism is the idea in positive psychology that a talent for joy, or like any other talent, can be cultivated. So it's contrasted with learned helplessness, which is a condition in which a person suffers from a sense of powerlessness. So learned optimism is fostered by consciously challenging any negative self-talk. And now that I'm hearing both of you talk about how important optimism is to your own success in your jobs, I think it's important that we think about this notion of learned optimism in order to bolster the success of the people we work with. So do you have any tips that you'd share with our listeners about ways that you might consciously challenge negative self-talk? Joey, do you have any tips about how you might consciously challenge negative self-talk?
Well, I can say coming to those conversations with empathy for the situation that the person you're engaged with is a huge first step. I can tell you what you shouldn't do is to remind somebody who's in a moment of negativity how good things are for them, or how lucky they are that things aren't as bad as they could be. That is not the way to do it. I've learned that one over the years. So taking time to hear from people what their challenges are and giving them space to express their concerns, then maybe potentially pointing out to them their successes along the way, milestones, or at the end of a project for, in our world, pretty project focused, showing people this is the result. Look at this thing you've done, or the thing you've contributed to. Reminding them of their successes. And I don't really know, actually, I'd be curious to hear from the two of you, if there's a way to deal with it in the moment, like in the acute state of negativity. Is there an effective way to bring positivity to that conversation? Do either of you have any experience in that world?
I'm really interested in shining the light on their agency, their sense of efficacy.
Yeah.
So helping them recognize where they have been able to make changes is really what fosters optimism. So it's not telling them so much what they've done and congratulating them on that, as much as it is asking them in a coaching kind of way, well, what's what's an area of your life where you've had control, you've been intentional, you've made steps, and then you've executed on that. And then they start to realize, oh, I can make change. I do have agency. And that then usually it's a matter of helping them find the pathway to do that, replicate that in some other areas of their life. Jill, do you have any other ideas?
Yeah, and I am thinking of that on a personal level too, because I don't want it to be out there that people with high optimism never experience negative self-talk personally.
No.
Because we do. There will be spirals. Typically, there'll be big spirals.
Yeah.
And so how do we challenge that? I think it goes back to that idea, right, of knowing your people and having those few core trusted relationships, those people that are going to reality test your good optimistic thoughts, but they're also going to reality test for you your negative self-talk as well. So having your people, I think some strategies that I've learned, not to sound too work wisdom commercially here, but in some of the workshops that we've done with Kedron and Sarah, thinking about this idea of the turnaround, and as you have a thought that's just, really nagging at you, is it true? And turning that thought around, and I know Kedron can explain the concept so much better, but processing it through a different lens, to look at it from a different perspective, has helped to kind of jolt my thought process. So I think that's huge. And I think the other thing that we've talked about in some of our workshops, just a concrete strategy, is taking it to the worst case scenario. So what's the worst possible outcome of this? And then once you think that through, so it's actually not that bad. I can make something good out of this. I can figure a way to work around or to break that cycle. So using some of those really concrete practices as well.
Yeah, Jill, I'm glad to hear that. So the turnaround is the work of Byron Katie, and people can look it up online and read some of her books and watch some of her TED Talks. But essentially, when you have this negative self-talk, this story that's on heavy rotation, as Brene Brown might say, you can disrupt it, or at least examine it and maybe turn it around. First, you take the story that you have on heavy rotation. The story might be, I don't know, my colleague doesn't respect me. Or that's a story we hear a lot in the workplace. My colleague doesn't respect me. You turn it around to the self, where you say, I don't respect me. And then you have to come up with 3 concrete times that was true. Then you turn it around to the other, which is rather than my colleague doesn't respect me, you then turn it into, I don't respect my colleague. Very often that's the epiphany point where you say, oh gosh, here it was. I thought she didn't like me. I don't like her, And so then you come up with 3 concrete times when that was true. And then you turn it around to the opposite, which is rather than my colleague doesn't respect me, you say, my colleague does respect me. And then you come up with 3 concrete times that that's true. But that has a really effective way of putting some cracks in these firmly held beliefs that can get some light in there, get some air in there, and maybe start allowing you to be more optimistic. So thanks for sharing that, Jill. I had not thought about that in terms of using that as a tool to build learned optimism and mitigate learned helplessness, but that absolutely would do it. I do want to ask,
very cool.
Yeah, I do want to ask a question about pessimists. So sometimes when we have high optimism, and we're on some team or part of some movement, and there's somebody who's just maybe making us bananas, and we can't figure out why they're driving us bonkers. Sometimes it's because they are pessimists. So I just wanted to ask you two, do we think that pessimists are our nemesis? Can you say that 3 times fast? Pessimists are our nemesis. But have you ever had the experience where there's someone who has lower usage of optimism than you might, and that pushes your buttons? Jill, do you have any experiences like that?
I do. And I would say that for me, this is an area that professionally I've really had to learn how to grow and develop. Because early on in my work, I think I would have cut pessimists out of the planning process because I wasn't sure what to do with it. I wasn't sure how to handle that and embrace that and leverage the feedback and the input that they brought to our teams. And so over the years, I've really come to learn how to take that feedback as feedback and again, build it into the strategy of optimism, build in those concerns and use that perspective to actually make a plan stronger and to make a team stronger. Because if we can bring a pessimist on board, oh my word, the power that has to create true, sustainable organizational change is incredible. Yeah. And so I've spent more time building those relationships, getting to know people on a personal level to move past what might be like a surface level perception of someone to really understand where those concerns are coming from.
Yeah. Joey, what's your experiments with pessimists?
I love that approach, and I think it's really valid, Jill. The sense that when we're doing any sort of communication through the organization, it's not just communication for me and people who think and act just like me. It's for everyone in the team. And if there are people with differing perspectives or different levels of usage of optimism, if we want to call them detail-oriented optimists or pessimists, it's important that the message gets through to them. So to your point, Jill, taking a pessimist perspective as insightful feedback on how we need to craft this message to be effective. That's a really positive and optimistic way to take that. I can certainly say that yes, in my life, the pessimist point of view does sort of drive me crazy. I don't understand sometimes why somebody would only see all the potential cracks in a otherwise beautiful scene. Yeah. And it challenges me and will continue to challenge me emotionally and professionally to come to terms with that. But regardless of how I feel about those perspectives, that is someone's perspective, and it's incumbent on me to respond to that and to respect it, to give it space, and to try to be effective in communication anyway there.
Joey, do you find too that if you know you're going into a meeting or a room or an encounter with a pessimist, do you have to, I have to mentally and emotionally prepare myself? I have to take a minute, check where I'm at emotionally and mentally, take a really deep breath and be really intentional about being ready to go into that encounter in a way that is going to be positive for all of us. I don't know. Do you find that, Joey?
I do, and I honestly probably have overcompensated in the past, and at the expense of being honest. Sometimes I've tried to use kid gloves to try to maybe I won't get super deep into this thing, because I know someone's going to be upset about some part of it, and that's not respectful or honest either. So it's a balance between recognizing the challenge of the situation and being, like you said, mentally prepared for that, and also being true to whatever the mission is or the message is that you have to deliver to. So it's a fun balance.
Yeah, it's also kind of ironic too, because optimism has to do with this positivity and this open-heartedness, and we have to use our optimism with pessimists, right? We have to come at them with that positivity, that open-heartedness, that deep listening, that patience that's going to help all of us find, exactly what our best usage is to move the goal forward. So I am so grateful to both of you for being part of this movement of helping other world changers in the workplace to enhance their individual and collective team performance. Thanks, listeners, for downloading The Behaviorist, and we hope you'll subscribe. Please reach out to us through our website, workwisdomllc.com, where you can enjoy Work Wisdom Press and productions, ask questions, and make suggestions of topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes. Today, we'll leave you with a quote from Oscar Wilde, also reinterpreted by Chrissy Hind. "We are all of us in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars."
We are all of us in the gutter. Some of us are looking at the stars.